please. maar 1 jaar. Balance. Yeah, it was close to the embassy. And then they had another block somewhere else. And then it was just.
We'll begin our evening with a small prayer. Let us pray. Le tōr mātou te mā, lo whio lava e ona vi inga mo le tanga. Nei ua mātou mua I walau atu e lo whio nei tū lao le awhiawhi. Whaftai atu e lo whio mātou au leo man nei tū lao nei awhiawhi. Whaftai ua tau nuk manuia le au malanga, tai o mā lo ese ma rātou au malanga. Whaftai I lo alofa maroanga lei fo ia te mātou le mawai. Vi ia pēr lava lo whio wāluanga lei a te mātou le li ia. Mātou talo le tua, whātasi mai lo whio nei tū la, ia mausi unga manuia nei wha moe moe, ia whapena fo nei wha manuia atu I mātou taitai, whapea fo taitai I mā lo netalani, Whapea mara au malanga, mo fo la tau le tonu, mara fia mara manuia, war tai inga o la tau malo tai tasi. Whapea na fo ma tau tai tai ma tau malo New Zealand, mo fo ia le manuia mara on sai, wa fo tai inga o nei malo. Mo mai ma tau manuia lo fio, whaatasi mai lo fio nei tu la fiafi. Ia I ume umalava mara manuia ona lo fio. Talo atu ono Yesu ma tu ore ma wala tuai nei. Amen.
He aha te hau e wawara mai. He tiu heraki. Nāna ia mai te puputara ki hikiota. E tiki nā tiu e te kōtu ko I te pauwhakairo ka tū ki te Waitemata I o ko Wairangi e. Te hea wā mauri ora. I aku rahi, I aku nui, I aku muku tangata, ko tai mai I rungi te kaupapa hui a kaimanoa, ko rangi tā miro tia nei I roto I tō tātou whale. Tērā tētahi o nā āhuatanga o tō tātou moana nui a kiwa, nau mai hara mai whakatau mai. Nau mai I roti te whale nei, me tōna manaakitanga ki a tātou, I roti te marutanga o tō tātou marae waipapa hoki, nau mai. Whakatau mai I rungi te karanga o te pō, te tainga mai te rangatira nei, I te pirimea ruta, nau mai, hara mai, whakatau mai I roto I te whale nei, ki te hononga, ki te mininga nei, I roti tō rangatiratanga, nau mai. Hala mai te mininga, I roti te kaupapa rangatira nei, kei te mihi kia koutou, ko tai ki te hakamahana tēnei whare o tātou, kei te mihi, kia tātou katua, kia koe hoki I tō tātou pirimea, tōn, tō tainga mai ki te hakarangatira tō tātou kaupapa, kei te mihi kia koe. Me o tini whakapapa, hononga ki tēnei wānanga o tātou, kei te mihi. Tuatahi, me wehe ki te atua koe te timatatanga me ta hakutinga o ngā mea katoa, I roti I tēnā, huritaki whakaro ki a koe, tō tātou minita, mō au kupu, whaere ki hia te ara pai mō tātou, nā reira kei te mihi ki a koe. Huri anō tōki whakaro ki te kainga tawhito, pota tau te whero, lo te waikohanga, me tōna mokopuna te tātou kingi tu heitia, e noho anei I tā hirewa tapu. Mauri mai o koutou tini āhuatanga ki te tūhono da āhuatanga o tēnei whale, o tēnei whenua, I rau te maru o Mangahekea, tētahi o nā ingo o tēnei wāhi, tū ana hau ki te mihi atu ki rātou kua whetū rangitia, e ngā mate katoa, haere atu rā. Ka piti hono tātai hono te hunga mate ki te hunga mate, piti hono tātai hono tātou te hunga ora, ko tai mai I rungi te karanga o tēnei pō, a tēnā koutou katoa. Nō ki te honari, ki te tū, ki te mihi kia koe, ki tō tātou manuhiri no tā wāhi, me tōna rangatira tanga, me tōna hekinga hononga kia tātou I roti I tēnei wāhi o Aotearoa, kei te mihi kia koe I te rangatira. Ka tū au, mo te taha o tō tātou toe sulu, Damon Salesa, tōna whare tēnei, tōku Waimārie ki te tū, ki te mihi kia koe, ki tēnei wā. Kia koe hoki I tō tātou manukura Scott, ki te kawe I nei rangatira, I nei manahiri mo tātou, nāre kei te mihi kia koe. Kia tātou katoa. Ka huri au ki te reo tuarua mo te wā poto, haka māra mai tātou katoa. Good afternoon, everybody. It's my privilege on behalf of the University, our whale, on behalf of Toi Sulu Damon Salesa, to welcome our esteemed visitors here this afternoon. Welcome to the University. Welcome also to our whale, one of the iconic places that talks about our connections through to the Pacific. So welcome to this place and all of the many connections that it has across the world, and we reach out in that spirit to you and all your many connections to join with us here this afternoon. We also stand not only on behalf of the university here, but on behalf of Ngāti Whātua o Lākei, the Manawhino o Konei, one of the local tribes of this region, to acknowledge, in the words of my ancestors, your arrival here today, and of course our Prime Minister Ardern. So, te rangatira, Mr. Ruta, tō tainga mai, ki te hakarangia tira tō tātou, kaupapa I tēnei pō, I roto I ngā kupu o te nota nei, nawhi pai tēnā moku, so in the words of the North, that's enough from me. But again, an absolute privilege to offer these words, this mihi whakatau to you and our Prime Minister here today. within this kaupapa, within this esteemed activity that we're offering this afternoon in our whare. So that is actually enough from me, but in the custom of our region here too, in this process that we'll offer a song. I haven't told the audience, but they're going to participate in the waiata now. So with that, I'm sure most of you will be familiar with the song Te Aroha. If you're not, just mouth the words as best you can. So etu tātou. Te aroha, te whakapono, me te rangi mari e tātou, tātou e. One more time. Te aroha, te whakapono, me te rangi mari e tātou, tātou e. E noho tātou. Kia ora tātou, ka mutu tēnā. Ko tēnei te wā, mo te manuhiri ki te hake ki mai nei I rungi te atamira, mo te hongi. So, sir, te piremia, we would now like to invite you and the group forward to participate in our hongi, the last part of this process, before we hand it over to our Chancellor. Hara mai.
E ngā mana, e ngā reo, e ngā hoi whā. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Bula Vinaka, malo e lele. Talofa lava, and a warm Pacific greeting to you all. Prime Minister Ardern, Prime Minister Ruta, the Honourable James Shaw, Lyndall Walker, and Ambassador Mira Wahlberg, and invited guests. My name is Scott St. John, and I am Chancellor of the University of Auckland, and I extend a warm welcome to you all on behalf of the University. Ko Scott St. John toko inoa, kei tamaki makaurau taku noho kaanga, ko o te manakura o te whare wānanga tamaki makaurau. Thank you, Damon, Michael and Elise, for welcoming our guests into the Whale. The Whale Pacifica Complex is the academic and spiritual home for the university's Pacific students, staff and researchers, as well as many others whose interests extend to the Pacific studies and Auckland's Pacific communities. The Whale Pacifica Complex aims to encourage future Pacific leadership in social, cultural and economic dimensions. Designed in the village style, the Whale symbolises a centre of intellectual debate and talanoa, so it is the perfect location for today's conversation. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the University of Auckland to take part in a conversation between two Prime Ministers. The New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern and the Netherlands Prime Minister Mark Rutte will participate in an interactive session on climate change and how we can ensure a just transition to a carbon neutral economy. Both leaders will share their ideas, followed by a panel discussion led by the University of Auckland's Jennifer Curtin, Professor of Politics and International Relations and Director of our Public Policy Institute. We will then open discussion and questions to the floor. I will begin by introducing our two Prime Ministers and Professor Curtin. Jacinda Ardern entered New Zealand's Parliament in 2008 at age 26, and 9 years later became the youngest ever leader of the Labour Party. Only 2 months after assuming the leadership, she led her party to electoral victory and was sworn in as Prime Minister, heading a three-party government involving New Zealand First and the Greens. She is currently the youngest female elected head of government in the world. As well as Prime Minister, she holds the role of Minister for National Security and Intelligence, Minister for Arts, Culture and Heritage, and Minister for Child Poverty Reduction, an issue particularly close to her heart and her self-proclaimed reason for entering politics. On assuming the role of Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern called climate change her generation's nuclear-free moment and has made taking action on climate change a priority for her government. Mark Rutte has been the Prime Minister of the Netherlands since October 2010. Prime Minister Rutte has served as the leader of the Party for Freedom and Democracy, the VVD, from 2006 to 2010. Prior to that, he had been State Secretary for Social Affairs and Employment. Moreover, he held a position as State Secretary for Education, Culture and Science. Prime Minister Rutte is also a member of the high-level panel on water, and in addition to his duties as Prime Minister, Mark Rutte teaches Dutch and social studies at a high school in The Hague every Thursday morning. Don't be late. Our moderator for today is Professor Jennifer Curtin, Professor of Politics and the Director of Public Policy Institute at the University of Auckland. Jennifer teaches and researches in the fields of comparative public policy, gender and inclusive policy analysis tools, Trans-Tasman policy innovations, and sport and politics. Jennifer is a New Zealand Fulbright Senior Research Scholar in 2012 and regularly speaks about issues connected with her research at national and international conferences and in the media. I would now like to invite Prime Minister Ardern to come forward and address the audience, followed by Prime Minister Rutte, followed by Professor Curtin, who will begin the panel discussion.
Thank you, Chancellor. Te whare e tūnei, te marae e tā koto ana, tēnā koroa, e ne mātai maha, haere, haere, haere. Nā tangata whenua o tēnei rohi o Tamaki Makaurau, nā te whātua o Rairaka, tēnā koutou. Tātou nā kānohi e hui mai ana, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Thank you, Chancellor, for that welcome, for that introduction. And can I start, of course, by acknowledging Prime Minister Rutte for joining us. It has been since the 1990s since we had a visit from Prime Minister of the Netherlands, and so it's a real joy to be able to welcome you here today. And I've very much enjoyed talking about all of the connections that we share as a nation, and that's not least, obviously, the ones we're here to discuss today. I want to acknowledge Minister James Shaw, who was part of our discussions today, given the strong dialogue that we are undertaking with our counterparts in the Netherlands around research and development, particularly in the space of agricultural missions, but maybe I'll save that for the panel. But thank you for being here too, Minister Shaw. Damon, those are staff and students, thank you for coming. I feel that it's particularly significant and emblematic, really, that we're having this meeting also in Awhare. I have to say, never far from my mind when we're discussing issues around climate change is that sense of responsibility and duty of care that we have as members of the Pacific. That when I think about climate change, I don't think just about hypothetical situations. I think about what I've already seen in Tuvalu, in Tokelau, in Samoa, in Tonga. Already the effects of climate change are very real, and in fact half of the most climate change affected nations in the world exist within the Pacific. So I see this as a moral duty and a very real duty, but it's also a global duty of care. I recently have returned, as has the Prime Minister, from the United Nations and the Secretary General's Climate Summit in New York. And you can imagine what it would have felt like sitting in the green room behind the stage of the UN, as I watched on the screen in that room, Greta Thunberg communicate with the world, but particularly world leaders, around her view and her message on behalf of young people. It was a particularly powerful message, and many of you will have seen it. I can tell you it was even more powerful to be in the vicinity at the time that it was delivered. And a couple of things went through my mind. One was that I wondered whether or not the people that needed to hear the message were in the room. The other was that despite the fact that we represent, in terms of total global gross emissions, 0.17%, that does not change the level of responsibility that we have, let alone any other nation. It just doesn't. These things aren't measured in terms of contribution. We all have to play our role. What I'm concerned about, though, is whether or not we spend enough time as a global community, not just talking about the moral obligation, but talking about, because perhaps this will bring some of those nations with us, talking about the opportunity as well. And something that Minister Shaw is particularly good at placing emphasis on increasingly is how we can talk about those challenges across energy, transport, manufacturing, waste, agriculture as global opportunities for cooperation. We have challenges in common, but there are ways in which we can work much more closely together to create the changes that we need. When it comes to New Zealand's contribution to the world, I am determined that one of those contributions will be in the way that we produce food. We can be and should be the most sustainable food producers in the world. And in doing so, we can commercialise and leverage that success through trade. Now, our farming leaders have made their own commitment to cutting emissions from food production. And over the next 5 years, our plan is to collaborate to build systems that every farmer will be able to use to measure, manage, and reduce their own farm emissions. And in doing so, we will be the first in the world to achieve that. But in doing so, we also need to provide tools and technology that will help our farmers, farm by farm, to meet their obligations. It's why we've continued in international collaboration through the Global Research Alliance on agricultural greenhouse gases. It's why we had the conversation we had today around the ways that we can work together on things like methane vaccines. And the reason New Zealand needs to be ahead of the game in this area is because our emissions profile in terms of agriculture is completely unique relative to other OECD nations. And so if we innovate, if we place that responsibility on ourselves to be at the front of the pack, then we have something that we are able to equally trade to the world, and it won't just be our brand. It will be our method of farming. And there is something significant in that. I think for now, though, is the time for both a sense of optimism about what's possible, but also that optimism needs to be coupled with a plan. And so I thought I'd spend my final couple of minutes, because I'd rather have dialogue between us, just talking very briefly about our plan to date. So many of you will know, over the past 2 years, we have been in a hurry. One of the things we're very keen to pass before the end of the year is the Zero Carbon Bill, which will place an obligation on us to stick within 1.5 degrees of warming, because that is what the Pacific needs if we're to avoid catastrophic weather events. We're strengthening our emissions trading scheme. We aim to plant 1 billion trees by 2028, and 150 million have already been planted. We've stopped issuing any new permits for oil and gas exploration offshore. We're investing in green hydrogen, biofuels, and have a goal of reaching 100% renewable electricity generation by 2035. We're making electric and cleaner cars more affordable, something that New Zealand has been too slow to do. We're investing heavily in rail, trains, buses, walking and cycling infrastructure, in fact, in the order of roughly $14 billion. We've established an $100 million green investment fund to help shift private investment towards the zero carbon economy of the future. And I would be remiss if I didn't add to that list that our business community is also stepping up with a Climate Leaders Coalition that collectively represents 60% of New Zealand's gross emissions. Ultimately, we've done more in 2 years than any government in New Zealand has ever done. But we haven't done that just so that we can say that. We've done it because it's necessary. We know there is more to do. And to be honest, I'm pleased that we continue to have the ongoing commitment of the public to turning out to rallies and events to continue to encourage climate action globally and domestically. So my message ultimately would be, we all know that we have to change the way that we govern. We have to change our economies for the future. But I'm optimistic that we have the ability and the power within our hands and within New Zealand to do that in a way that we can feel proud that we're doing our bit in the middle of the Pacific. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Chancellor, Professor, dear colleague, ladies and gentlemen, nau mai, hara mai. It's a privilege for me to be speaking to you today in this, I believe, really remarkable occasion. You can feel that this building is more than just a physical space. It's a social and spiritual center where people truly connect. And it is certainly a welcoming place. And it shows how essential it is to find a sense of connection with the people around you, with your ancestors, with nature and the elements. In the Netherlands, we are perhaps less aware of that, even though we have spent many centuries living side by side with water. I grew up in The Hague, a city on the North Sea coast. So the sea, the beach and the dunes have always been part of my daily life. And when I fly back to the Netherlands later this week, my plane will land at Schiphol Airport, which is located 4 meters below sea level. And that is our reality. My home and the most densely populated region of my country, 7 million people, exist only because of an ingenious system of coastal protection, flood barriers and reclaimed land. As we like to say, God created Earth, the Dutch created the Netherlands. So you'll understand that every centimeter of sea level rise poses a threat to us. And like the Pacific Islands in this region, the Caribbean islands that are part of our kingdom are especially vulnerable to the effects of climate change. So, although the Netherlands and New Zealand could not be further apart geographically, we are natural partners in this respect. And that's why I'm delighted we have signed a joint statement today highlighting our shared commitment to combating climate change. And yes, that commitment is essential, because the problem is extremely urgent. For decades now, we've been talking and talking and talking about the need to take next steps. But too often, fine words and political promises have not translated into action. So it's now time for ambitious climate targets, but particularly now for solid measures for achieving them. In the Netherlands, we have been raising the bar. We are going to reduce domestic emissions by 49% by 2030 and 95% by 2050 compared to 1990 levels. And within the EU, we are setting our sights on climate neutrality by 2050. So you may well be thinking, those are impressive ambitions, but how are we going to get there? I believe the first step is to realize that you can't simply impose new measures from above, because ultimately you need all sections of society to make the transformation. The members of the public, small businesses and large corporations, scientists, NGOs and local authorities, to name just a few. And that's why we brought representatives of all relevant parties to the table to make a deal. We had several months, in total almost 18 months of intensive talks. And then we concluded the National Climate Agreement, which contains concrete measures to ensure that we can, yes, indeed, achieve our targets. They include phasing out all coal-fired power plants by 2030, imposing a targeted carbon levy on industry, and stepping up our efforts on offshore wind power. And yes, I realize, of course, that these measures alone will not be enough. As Albert Einstein once said, we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking we used when we created them. So we need novel ideas, groundbreaking innovations, new energy. And for that, we need you, our young people. My generation and the generations before us created this climate crisis. And I'm sorry to have to say this, but it will be largely up to your generation to turn the tide by coming up with original and inventive solutions and by thinking outside the box. I believe that any problem can be solved with this approach. As we have already seen, we can achieve more if we all join forces. Earlier today, I visited the Port of Auckland, which is working with a Dutch company to develop the world's first fully electric tugboat. The port is also partnering with the Dutch company Philips to replace all its floodlights with LEDs, which will enhance efficiency and sustainability. And in a completely different field, our countries are working together to tackle one of the most damaging sources of greenhouse gas emissions. And here I'm not talking about all diesel cars or coal-fired power plants. I'm talking about cows, which emit highly damaging methane gas into the atmosphere every day. The good news is that a Dutch company working with research institutes here in New Zealand has developed a food supplement that will reduce cattle emissions by 30%. It's amazing where innovation and cooperation can lead. It is very helpful. And it seems to me that if we can make the gas produced by cows more climate friendly, there's no limit to what we can achieve collectively. So I hope that all of you, with your knowledge, your energy, your enthusiasm and your brain power, I hope you will all play your part. Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister Ardern and Prime Minister Rutte. So my job here this afternoon is to ask you a few questions to warm you up for the remainder of the time when we will receive questions from the floor. And I'm sure there are a lot of things that you will all want to ask our Prime Ministers about. But let's start with a few warm-ups. Prime Minister Ardern, you mentioned Greta Thunberg's address, and there's been a lot of discussion and some backlash to her comments at the United Nations and the important and visible role that young people are playing in calling for climate action. So let's assume Greta and the hundreds of thousands of young people who were on strike a couple of weeks back are watching now, and you had the support of your parliaments to do one really radical thing to ameliorate the climate crisis right now. What would that action be? Thinking about Greta's call for deeds, not words.
You use the word radical, but I think actually most of the things that we need to do are necessary as opposed to radical. Radical makes it sound as though it's something that you do and that is just, you know, isn't necessitated, whereas actually everything that we're doing now is. It is necessary. And so what could be more necessary than actually dealing with the most significant contribution to our emissions profile than methane emissions? We have to, and it makes up the majority, and yet it's the area where we will have to, by default, be world leading because no one else is tackling this issue in the way that New Zealand is proposing to. And we're doing it for two reasons. A, because we're unique in that profile amongst developed nations, and so to do our bit, we need to. But B, you know, if you ask a New Zealander what's part of our, I'd like to think, part of our identity, I think most of us would mention something about the environment. You know, I just think it's intrinsic to who we are. And so if that story now is extending beyond just talking about, you know, clean waterways and beautiful beaches and being litter-free, now caring about the environment is also thinking about your emissions, then naturally it makes sense for us as a people who care about our environment to make sure that our story and our brand is now linked to climate action. So I would create a mechanism that farm by farm allows every farmer to know how much they're emitting, to have a plan in place to reduce that, and to have a system that recognises and rewards where those reductions occur. That would be world leading. That would revolutionise the way that we produce food for the world, and it would be in keeping with who we are. And you can call it radical if you will, but actually that's what we're going to do.
Well, I would say applause to that. Yeah. And you will. No, I like that answer very much because this is a big issue. But I would say two things. One is, it is not one big radical idea. We need all the small steps to take them at the same time together, whilst at the same time making sure that it creates new jobs, innovation, that it will inspire all the generations to come along. And if there was one thing I would love to do, if it was possible, but it is not possible yet, to take out the coal-fired power plants earlier than we have so far decided. And we have a scheme, and we have to do it in such a way that the country is not dark at night. So we still need the coal-fired power plants for the foreseeable future, but we hope to take them all out by 2030.
Excellent. So climate change, as you've both talked about, doesn't respect state borders. It requires a global response. But the implementation, as you've both noted, of mitigation strategies requires action at the state level, both national and local. So in addition to the list of actions that you've talked about this afternoon, do you see a special place in the world in terms of what small and medium-sized economies like New Zealand and the Netherlands can do to add to what you've already talking about? Like, what's special about being a small to medium economy in this space?
I think in part our ability to innovate. You know, we've always taken, I think, a bit of an approach when it comes to innovation that we don't have to, you know, we often use examples like the health sector, that we don't have to create every medical device that the world needs, but we could be really, really good at sleep apnea or little niche areas. Well, actually, we can be really, really good at advancements in agricultural technology, for instance. And so when I, visit places around the country and see some of those little innovations, be it what people are doing with kelp or even just farming practice, I think this is actually where we have something really to offer the world, because we are already an unsubsidized agricultural nation that was forced to innovate and be productive and profitable decades ago. So we need to keep using that innovation now. The other thing I'd say is that equally, we need to make contributions, even though we'd consider ourselves small in terms of contribution. That doesn't mean that we don't have a contribution to make to others who are seeking to adapt and mitigate. Now, no profile will be smaller than that of our Pacific neighbours. I mean, Tuvalu, population of 11,000, Tokelau 1,500, and yet their view is, well, if we're going to go out and ask the world to make efforts and changes to benefit us, we're going to make sure that we're doing the same things ourselves. So a lot of these island nations moving towards being 100% renewable electricity generation, they need support to move away from diesel generation. And that's something that through our $300 million climate fund, we're working to support as well, because it's about everybody, regardless of size, doing their bit.
Yes, I think what we as smaller, medium-sized countries can do is indeed speed, the absence of too much politics and too much interference by interest groups, if possible, to come to a speeding up the process. And let me give you one example. As I said, the Netherlands, half of the country is below sea level. So climate adaptation, next to mitigation, but also adaptation to the rising sea levels, is something we are good at. And where we can learn from what you are doing here in New Zealand, but also what we have added in New Orleans, in New York, in Boston, what we are doing all over the US and in Bangladesh, everywhere in the world. Trying to almost make a sort of export product by co-creating, of course, with those nations and the problems they are facing, and learning both from what we are implementing, and do it in such a way that you're not just building concrete dikes like we did in the 60s and 70s, but also now building with nature, creating artificial islands if that is beneficial to offset some of the impacts of rising sea levels. The Netherlands is part of a kingdom, including Curaçao and Aruba and Sint Maarten and other islands in the Caribbean, and they're all facing their own issues now with climate change. And we try to learn from what they are doing and adding our engineering logic and experience to the situation on those islands. And that is something I think we as medium-sized countries can do. We can make up speed. We have highly innovative societies, young people who can add to this. And that speed and innovation, I think, is really what we can add to the world.
We can also gang up together.
Absolutely.
And, you know, I mean, we may be small, but we're good at building coalitions often when you're small. And so, you know, our joint work on fossil fuel subsidies, for instance, these are areas where actually collectively we can create a bit of clout when we join with one another.
You built a coalition with Costa Rica, Iceland, others.
For the trade agreements.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So you've both mentioned the islands and the Pacific and the rising sea levels. So we know that the impact of climate change will be both intergenerational and immediate, and unevenly borne by peoples in different socioeconomic situations and in different parts of the globe. And here we know that are going to be challenges with increasing numbers of climate refugees. So how do you see your respective countries working around in the area of international law to push for more acceptance and strategies to enable climate refugees to find new homes if that's necessary?
First, if I can just make a brief on your introduction to that question. You know, you're absolutely right. This is generational. I don't think we should, and Prime Minister Rutte has been very good at articulating that. I think we also underestimate the anxiety and the mental health impacts on the generation that are battling this. You know, I've a couple of occasions now had conversations with young climate activists who you can just see the toll that the anxiety of this issue is creating. And I don't think we can underestimate that. And it's something I think about a lot. And that therefore is one of the reasons we need to be demonstrating progress, is because if we don't, we're actually impacting negatively on the well-being of that generation as well. I just wanted to mention that. But your question, sorry. I digress.
Climate refugees.
Sorry?
On climate refugees.
Oh, climate refugees, forgive me. Do you know, when I came in to the leadership role for Labour, this was a question I got posed a lot, because we were exploring this issue of climate refugees and what New Zealand could be doing alongside its neighbours to demonstrate the sense of responsibility we had. And likewise, the Green Party had been thinking a lot about that as well. And then I started visiting and having bilaterals with my Pacific neighbours, and something really powerful occurred to me. that this was very much the view of a country who was preparing itself to be the recipient of refugees, as opposed to the view of a nation who might be the refugee, the source of refugees. And their view was that we risk giving up if we talk about that issue more than we talk about mitigation. And so times when I've put this question and asked those who would be most climate affected, they say to me, well, you're asking me to consider giving up my homeland, my culture, and my identity. And so that's something that I think we have to be really mindful of, that actually right now, those island nations want us to keep fighting. They don't want us to give up. They don't want us to resolve from our responsibility to preserve them in their homeland. So yes, does that mean that we give up on our duty of care to have preparations in place? No. But let's not forget what the primary focus needs to remain to be. And when you ask someone from Tuvalu, that's what they'll tell you. And I can tell you that because I've asked them.
Because they want to stay on Tuvalu. And that means that we, exactly as you said, mitigation, sometimes adaptation, or how can we help some of these regions to cope with the impact of rising sea levels, which is particularly, of course, with the small island development states in the Pacific, a big issue. In the Caribbean, there's also the big issue now of hurricanes originating from climate change, at least at the current rate and impact they have, which is different from, let's say, 5 or 10 years ago. So climate, and that means also how do you build hurricane shelters? How do you deal with that in the Caribbean part of the world? This is crucial. Of course, the impact of climate change on the geopolitical situation, when you look at Africa, when you look at the Middle East, the fact that so many farmers are now going to the cities, to leave their farms because they are incapable, because of rising temperatures, to maintain their livelihood as farmers, is having a huge geopolitical impact. And some thinkers and think tanks even suggest that some of the geopolitical tensions are increasing now because of the climate change issues facing those parts of the world. But to keep it close to home, the first step is to prevent it and not to prepare for the refugees coming in. It is to prevent it from happening.
So you've both talked about global opportunities as well as global challenges. And we know that climate change poses challenges for the production of clean and sustainable sources of electricity, the demand for which is likely to increase, especially for cooling in the summer. So you've talked a little bit about innovation, or quite a lot about innovation actually. So what new infrastructure investments will you be embarking on to meet energy requirements? Are there lessons that you can learn from each other in this space?
We've obviously we have geothermal, we have solar, we have wind, we have hydro. We're lucky, you know. We are a lucky nation in that regard. But that actually gives us room for further innovation still. And so if I was to tell you one of the areas where I'm most enthusiastic and optimistic is around the opportunity that's presented by green hydrogen. I put emphasis on the green hydrogen because obviously there are other options for generation, but green is where the opportunities really exist. And some of you may not know, but in the central North Island, there is a joint venture between a trust, a Māori trust here in New Zealand, and a Japanese company to produce and use domestically and also export hydrogen. And that project will, they hope, get off the ground in the beginning of early next year. And that hydrogen is produced using geothermal energy. Now, this is an amazing opportunity because not only is it's the trust plan at the moment to use that hydrogen to eventually power their milk tankers, which is picking up milk and taking it to their milk powder factory, which is currently powered through geothermal energy, which they then use the waste product from to fertilise their tomato plants, which they then sell to New Zealanders. It is a version, in this little space, I think, a version of the future of New Zealand's economy. And so not only is that element exciting, it's also for Japan a way that they can contribute to, of course, the energy challenges they have, and they, of course, hope to create in 2020, I believe, a carbon neutral Olympics. And so this is an example, I think, of the exciting future opportunities that exist if we continue to invest in new technologies. Now, because we are obviously trying to transition our economy, but also our regional economy, so Taranaki, when we said, okay, the future is not fossil fuels for us, we need to support this region to transition to new energy generation. We've created and funded a new energy research centre that will be based out of Taranaki. They have a hydrogen roadmap that they're preparing because locally this is where they want to move to, is hydrogen generation rather than a reliance on oil and gas industries. So these are all things that ultimately you start seeing a transition towards when you're honest about where the future lies. Now, if you continue to have a world where there are $500 billion worth of fossil fuel subsidies, you are sending the wrong message about where the future exists, and you are incentivizing the wrong decisions. So yes, we made some hard calls at the beginning of being a government, but it was so that people would start making the right investment decisions, and so we could have exciting projects like the ones we're seeing emerge now.
Well, we're also investing in all the technologies mentioned, including, of course, in our case, wind power, because we have a lot of wind in the Netherlands. We have not so much sun, but even there you see that the innovations are coming along at such a pace that it is halving the price of solar power and almost doubling the capacity every so many years. So there are huge opportunities in that sector. We have the advantage, as the Netherlands is embedded in Europe with neighbors like, for example, Germany. We work together with these countries on hydrogen. We work together on grid capacity and how do you make use of excess capacity when that comes out of wind or solar. And for example, to make it possible for other countries to produce less of, let's say, nuclear or coal-fired power plant energy. And that's making use of that grid system within the European Union. So we have to play the whole system, and we have to make use of every technology available in this transition towards a carbon-free production, of course, of electricity, etc. But that will take us the next 10 to 30 years, in which gas will still be a transition fuel. It's unavoidable. Moving away from oil and coal, gas will probably be for the next 20, 30 years still in the European Union at least be a transition form of power.
Great. So that's it from me. I'm going to open it up to the floor and give some of the students a chance to ask questions. So I'd like to see some hands. Okay, I'm going to go girl, boy. So I'm going to go over here first. There's a roving mic.
So you talk a lot about innovation, and I respect that, but how do we know that the key innovators are going to be, like, how do you know it's not going to just be the private corporations that are making green things for rich people? How can we ensure it's for all people, not just the wealthy and the elite of society, the innovation that people, yeah.
It's a good question. In fact, this is one of the things that I'm really mindful of when we have this conversation around transport in New Zealand in particular. You know, if we're talking about, as tends to dominate conversations, EVs, then the price point for those, let's be honest, is very high currently. So I am very mindful of that. And so what do we need to think about? Well, giving people choices, first of all. And actually, there are cheap, second-hand, low-emission vehicle options that aren't EVs but are low-emitting vehicles that are actually in the category of some of the most popular cars in New Zealand and cheap as well. But we don't do much at all to make sure that consumers know that that is a car that will actually save them money over the lifetime cost of the vehicle. because of its efficiency, nor do we create extra incentives for consumers to purchase them. So surely we should be sending stronger market signals that actually keeps in mind those who are making choices at different parts of the spectrum. Secondly, we need more public transport options. So we need more options that are obviously at the price point that is lower and more accessible. And at the moment, many people just don't have access to those choices. Now that's an example in the 20% of our emissions contribution for New Zealand, but actually that's a place where individuals can make a big difference to our profile. And so that's an example of where I think we do, and we are constantly mindful of thinking about this as an issue for every New Zealander, just as an example.
Well, of course, the car industry is an important topic here, and we have decided that by 2030 in the Netherlands you cannot buy new cars driving on gasoline, on the traditional gasoline, so only electrical cars or maybe hydrogen. That's a big decision. And what you now see is that this creates a lot of innovations in the car industry. Already in the US, in some states, you have these small Fiats, this Italian brand, small cars, which are currently not sold in Europe. You can only buy more expensive electrical cars, for example, the Teslas. Yeah, they are for the rich people. So you want to make these electrical cars available for the people on a normal budget. Secondly, what helps a lot, of course, is biking. I bike to the office when it is not raining. I try to take the bike. I was watching here the system in New Zealand. I don't see so
very
many...
flat.
It's very flat. Yeah, the Netherlands is very flat. But it's even healthier if it is not so flat to take the bike. And therefore, I'm happy to announce that my New Zealand colleague has told me that she will take the bike to her office when it is nice weather. In Wellington. So
I walk. Great? So I walk the 500 metres between Premier House and Parliament.
Is it so close by?
It is very close.
Okay, but when then you said to me that when you're going to shop, you will take the bike.
Yes, so I apparently need to get an electric bike now because of this.
But we will send our bike specialists to New Zealand because you need here more biking lanes, biking stopping lights, etc. And having hills is very healthy.
We have a question over here.
Hi, Jacinda.
Oh, hey, Leo, how are you?
Prime Minister Rudd, thank you for coming
I don't
to New
know
Zealand.
everyone in this room. I should tell you on a first-name basis.
I'm in international relations.
No, do you know what's ruined it? As we walked in, I was like, that's Niels. I went to school with him. So now the Prime Minister thinks I know everyone because it's New Zealand. Sorry, Leo, continue.
That's okay. I'm an international relations student, and I've been following the Belt and Road Initiative quite closely.
Oh, are you allowed to do off-topic questions?
No, but it's related.
Okay. I'll circle back.
Yeah,
okay.
the Yale University Environmental Science Department found out that if the project is completely completed, the temperature increase will be up to 2.7 degrees, and that's alarming to me. So my question to you both is, how would you deal with China in terms of putting sustainability in the Belt and Road Initiative? Because it's an important project for our country.
A very interesting question, Leo. I haven't been asked this before. Look, ultimately, we can't determine. These are very much projects that are formed in at a bilateral level. So New Zealand has what I would say is a framework rather than a list of projects that we have signed up to. So we don't have a list of infrastructure projects or anything per se around Belt and Road. We have a memorandum of arrangement. And that is something that we are still in conversation around what that will mean for New Zealand and China. But actually, what I'm increasingly seeing and hearing is that it's not just about infrastructure. It might be, for instance, us sharing more around what it means for what infrastructure in virtual terms we have that make us the #1 place in the world for ease of doing business, some of our e-commerce tools and so on. So we're thinking a little bit more laterally around what some of those projects might be, and some of them have zero carbon impact. But it's something I think we need to be mindful of. Of course, in our bilateral trade negotiations now, we are putting in a huge amount of work to think about environmental protections or standards that can go into those trade relationships. So we will be consistent in the way we think about those things.
Yes, I think you're right that these Belt and Road Initiative things are basically bilateral. And for the Netherlands, I mean, we have to see how this all will all evolve. What the place of Rotterdam, the port of Rotterdam will be in the whole system, and how the other spikes going into Africa, how that will play out. But generally speaking, China, I believe, is waking up very much to the issue of climate change. I was in Beijing with Prime Minister Li Keqiang in June. They opened up the first branch outside the Netherlands on the Climate Adaptation Commission. We started a year ago, and which will lead to a big summit next year, October, in Amsterdam. So they, the first non-Dutch regional branch of the Climate Adaptation Center is now in Beijing. They are working on concepts like sponge cities, which are able to basically absorb the rainfall when it is increasing, but also cities which will help you by design to deal with too much sunlight, for example, that you have places where there is shadow so that people can still survive in these days of climate change. And of course, not as an alternative to climate mitigation, but also as an addition. We need this climate, next to mitigation, we need the adaptation. And particularly in China, there is a political societal issue. And people are protesting because of the impact of climate change on the country and the quality of the air in cities like, of course, Beijing and Shanghai, but also in the Bay Area above Hong Kong. You have these debates now in society, and people are really protesting about this. So this is an issue which the Chinese leaders, is my understanding, are taking very seriously.
So we have a question over here next.
Kia ora, my name's Olivia. I'm a Master of Public Policy student here at the university. My question is about adaptation rather than climate change mitigation. Does the Labour-led government see a commitment to climate change adaptation written into legislation similar to the Delta Act in the Netherlands, which ensures commitment to adapting to the effects of climate change, and also it guarantees a commitment to financial investment from every cabinet throughout the next decade?
Actually, I mean, this is one of the elements of obligation, really, of course, that we would expect through our Zero Carbon Act. And this is the kind of infrastructure that I think needs to be in place so that we have a sustained and long-term approach to both adaptation and mitigation. And it needs to be partnered between central and local government in particular. And so that's something that we've had conversations about directly with local government, but that we will need to formulate action plans around as part of our zero carbon obligations. But we need to see it endure. And this is one of the reasons why, and in fact, if you ask the UK why their zero carbon legislation has been successful, they say it's because they built consensus. And so for us at the moment, we still have some concerns over whether or not we will be able to build that consensus, which means that then we run the risk that we have legislation for the period in which we're in office. And that's not good for anyone. We need certainty for our planning purposes so that local government know and have a plan that they can stick to and are assured that they have a partnership with central government around. And equally, we need our citizens to know that we've got a plan we're going to stick to as well. So yes, we're working in that regard. We're working towards that plan. But at the moment, I want it to be 30-year, not 3-year.
Yes, you need that consistency over the electoral cycle, particularly when you make a plan for 2030, basically moving into 2050. On this Delta plan, of course, it was the original Zeeland in the Netherlands, which was hit by the storm tide in 1953, and many people died. By the way, you made one mistake here in this Zeeland. You put in an A as a third letter. It should be an E. So you misspelled the name. I hope I can correct that in the next 12 hours. That would be a nice target. But then we created this Delta plan. And the Delta plan basically says that you have to be consistent in your investment. So we will now invest 1 billion euros each year over the next 80 years, till the year 2100, on improving our diking system, but particularly, as I mentioned in my introduction, or on one of the questions, building with nature. Because these small fisher towns, for example, they don't want to don't want to basically. You cannot see them anymore because of the dikes getting so high, and they are from concrete, so they are not very nice to see. And if you build with nature, if you make use of the tidal streams, for example, and what is happening in the rivers and in the sea system, we have now the technology to do this in a much more environmentally friendly way than we did, let's say, in the 1950s and 60s. And also making use of those technologies is very useful, and also something we try to export to countries like Bangladesh, for example, which is also a delta region, and some of the delta regions in the US.
So one last question at the back, a gentleman over here who's been very patient. So we only have time for one more question, and it needs to be quick and short, please.
Hi, the IPC report is pretty grim reading for everybody. In terms of looking at global constitutionalism, do you think that's one of the levers that we all have to maybe move this on in a pace that we're all wanting to? That sort of 3 years instead of 30 years approach?
But what we agree upon, well, we agree on almost everything, but particularly also on this issue, I would call this climate diplomacy. That we need to help other countries to raise the bar and then to make it practical in terms of how to implement it. I remember visiting Guterres, the UN Secretary General, last year in September. This was not this year's annual assembly, but last year's annual assembly. And he was asking me and Sigrid Kaag, our Minister for Foreign Aid and Foreign Trade, help me with others like New Zealand and Australia and countries in Europe to raise the bar. We can look at the US, for example, Trump leaving the Paris Climate Agreement. Yes, I'm not happy about it. But at the same time, we see that big cities and big states like California in the US are still committed to the Paris climate goals. So still a lot is happening in the United States as we speak. And in terms of how to deal with this in a governance structure is not easy, because this runs directly into and hits against the role, of course, of the democracies, the local and regional democracies. And they at the end and finally have to decide what they want to do. So this is about creating this sense of urgency, but also the options and opportunities. And I'm convinced when countries start to see this is not only, you don't do this only for preventing CO2 emissions. There's also a geopolitical reason to become less dependent on a few countries who produce all the oil and gas in the world. You can also do this if you don't believe in climate change, because you want to be part of the innovations. And you know that many new jobs will come from this. So there are so many reasons why you do this. I think it should start from the realization that the Earth is warming up. But there are so many other alternative reasons to do this. And I think if we are able, people like Jacinda, myself, others in the developed democracies in the world, to convince others to stick to these ambitions, we can achieve a lot. And it's not preaching. It has to be taking them along, trying to get the commitment.
And actually the point that the Prime Minister makes is exactly the right one, that actually if we create that level playing field, it removes the incentive for anyone to act outside of the system. So that's not just the case for governments. Actually, within the private sector, I would say as well, seeing that rather than people taking competitive advantage by continuing to use practices that ultimately have poor environmental outcomes but maintain profitability, if we actually remove people competing at that level and instead compete on service, quality and things that actually don't have a negative effect, then we're all the better for it. And so as countries, we need to keep making that argument, because the last thing we want are industries that say, don't do this to us. Our competitors aren't having this price put on them, so you're disadvantaging us. So there's a real argument to be made for why that's so important. The thing I will say when it comes to actually trying to get that long-term consensus politically is really, I'll finish with a message of hope. Yes, domestically we haven't necessarily got there in New Zealand yet. It's one of the things that I'm not giving up on yet, the Minister's not giving up on yet, but we are still trying to build consensus for the zero carbon legislation. But if we don't get the opposition to vote for it, I can assure you we're passing it anyway. But I will share this. I believe that we will move to a place in New Zealand's future where we stop having the kind of debate that we're having now. And I believe that because 10 years ago, I remember standing up at a Federated Farmers hosted meeting in Matamata and talking about climate change, and I was booed. And I can guarantee you that wouldn't happen now. We are not having a debate anymore about whether climate change is real. We're having a debate about what we need to do and how quickly we need to do it. And that is vastly different than the parliament I entered 10 years ago, where a select committee was set up by ACT to question the science of climate change. So we have made, I know we all cringe, but we have made progress, and we will keep making progress. We just cannot give up. So don't give up.
And on that note, thank you both very much for your very direct responses. And I'll hand over to Chancellor Scott St John.
Thank you all for attending and contributing to a lively and informative debate. Prime Ministers, I share your optimism. Certainly in the boardrooms that I'm involved in, these issues are front and centre of every strategy discussion. At this university, some of our finest minds are working on mapping the rumen to unlock the mystery of methane. And also at this university, I'm a little bit proud of this, in the most recent Times Higher Education Impact Rankings, which measure each university's performance against the United Nations Sustainability Goals, this university ranked first in the world, and we're rather proud of that. Congratulations. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Curtin, for moderating the session for us. Prime Minister Ardern, Prime Minister Ruta, I know you've got very busy schedules, and we understand you need to move away immediately to attend something else with your ambassadors. I thank you both for taking the time with us today to discuss the significant national and international challenge. The Honourable James Shaw, I acknowledge you being here and spending this time with us. We appreciate it. I'd like to ask everybody to remain seated while both Prime Ministers and their delegations leave the Whālei to their waiting cars. Thank you.
What they put in and what they didn't. Why did that insist on the beach? Oh my god. Oh, kom eens. Did you notice? Yes.